She should have kept walking. That's what Clara Wynne had learned to do. Keep moving, don't look back, don't let anyone see the desperation in your eyes. But when that barefoot little girl grabbed her hand outside the diner that had just thrown her out, when those innocent eyes looked up and asked, "Want to meet my daddy?" everything stopped. Clara had been running from a past that wasn't even hers for 3 long years. She'd learned that kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet here she was, following a child she didn't know toward a ranch she'd never seen, about to discover that sometimes the places we stumble into by accident become the only home we've ever truly known. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Clara's journey travels. The heat that summer could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Clara Wynne had learned that lesson the hard way, walking the sun-scorched roads between towns that all looked the same, tired, suspicious, and eager to send her on her way. Red Hollow was supposed to be different, or maybe she'd just gotten better at lying to herself. The town appeared through the shimmer of heat waves like a mirage, all weathered wood and faded paint, clinging to existence in the middle of nowhere. Clara's boots, worn so thin she could feel every stone through the soles, kicked up small clouds of red dust with each step. Her throat felt like sandpaper. The canteen at her hip had been empty since yesterday. She'd walked 17 miles to get here. 17 miles on the promise that Red Hollow had a boarding house that sometimes took in travelers without asking too many questions. That's all she needed. 1 night, maybe 2, to rest her feet and earn enough doing laundry or mending to buy supplies for the next stretch of road. The main street was nearly empty in the afternoon heat. A few horses stood tied to posts, heads low, tails swishing at flies. An old man sat on a bench outside the general store, hat pulled low over his face. He didn't look up as Clara passed. The diner sat on the corner of Main and Cedar, a sagging structure with a hand-painted sign that read, "Maggie's Place." Through the dusty window, Clara could see people inside. Actual people, sitting at tables, eating real food. Her stomach clenched painfully. When was the last time she'd had a proper meal? 2 days? 3? She pushed open the door. The smell of fried chicken and fresh bread hit her like a physical thing, so overwhelming she had to steady herself against the door frame. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward her. Clara had gotten used to this, the stares, the sudden silence, the way people's eyes traveled from her face to her worn clothes to the small bag she carried that held everything she owned in the world. She'd gotten used to it, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. "Help you?" The woman behind the counter was large and red-faced, wiping her hands on a stained apron. Her voice carried no welcome, only wariness. "I'd like some water, please." Clara's voice came out rougher than she intended. "And if you have any work, washing dishes, cleaning, I can pay for a meal that way." The woman's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward slightly, studying Clara's face with an intensity that made Clara want to run. Then her expression changed, shifted into something harder, colder. "You're that woman." It wasn't a question. "From the wanted posters 3 years back, Clara Wynne. Thought you looked familiar." The room temperature seemed to drop despite the oppressive heat outside. Clara felt every eye in the room boring into her back. "I served my time," Clara said quietly. "I'm just passing through." "We don't serve criminals here." The woman's voice rose, making sure everyone could hear. "And we don't have any work for thieves. I suggest you keep on passing through." "I didn't steal anything." The words came out before Clara could stop them, a reflex, a defense she'd repeated so many times it felt hollow even to her own ears. "I was wrongly convicted. If you just, I don't care what you think you did or didn't do." The woman moved from behind the counter, her bulk suddenly intimidating. "The law said you were guilty, and that's good enough for me. Now get out of my establishment before I call the sheriff." Clara's hands trembled, from exhaustion, from thirst, from the crushing weight of being judged for something she'd never done. 3 years. 3 years since she'd been arrested for stealing money from the family she'd worked for as a governess. 3 years since she'd stood in a courtroom and watched 12 men who'd never met her before decide her fate in less than an hour. 3 years since she'd learned that the truth mattered far less than who people wanted to believe. She'd served 18 months in a women's prison, 18 months of hard labor and harder lessons about how the world really worked. When they'd released her, she'd had nothing, no references, no money, no family willing to claim her. just her name on a piece of paper that said, "Released," and a past that followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. "I just need water," Clara tried one more time, hating the pleading note that crept into her voice. "I have a few coins." "Out," the woman pointed to the door. "Now." Clara turned, her face burning with humiliation. As she walked back toward the entrance, she heard the whispers starting, the voices discussing her as if she weren't there. Imagine having the nerve to show her face in here. Probably casing the place, looking for what she can steal. Someone should warn the sheriff. The sunlight outside hit her like a slap. Clara stumbled down the 2 wooden steps to the dusty street, blinking against the brightness. Her vision swam slightly, from the heat, from exhaustion, from the familiar despair that threatened to swallow her whole every time this happened. And it happened more often than not. She needed to leave Red Hollow. That much was clear. The boarding house wouldn't take her in now. News traveled fast in small towns. By sunset, everyone would know that Clara Wynne, convicted thief, had dared to walk their streets. She'd be lucky if they just asked her to leave. In some towns, they'd done worse. Clara started walking, heading back toward the edge of town. Maybe she could find a stream before dark, refill her canteen. Maybe there would be another town in 10 or 15 miles, one where nobody recognized her face from those damned posters. Maybe, Miss, wait! The voice was small, high-pitched, and breathless. Clara turned to see a little girl running after her, bare feet slapping against the packed earth. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with wild, honey-colored hair that had partially escaped from 2 braids and a faded blue dress that had been patched multiple times. Her face was round and sunburned, scattered with freckles, and her eyes, deep brown and somehow ancient despite her youth, locked onto Clara with startling intensity. "Miss, you forgot something!" The girl held out her hand, and Clara saw she was holding something wrapped in a checkered cloth. "I didn't," Clara started to say, but the girl was already pushing the bundle into her hands. "You dropped it," the child insisted, with the stubborn certainty of the very young. "When you were leaving Maggie's, I saw it fall." Clara unwrapped the cloth and found half a loaf of bread and a chunk of cheese. Her throat tightened. She looked at the girl, this small stranger with dirt on her cheeks and kindness in her eyes, and couldn't find words. "I didn't drop this," Clara finally managed. You shouldn't—" "My name's Molly," the girl interrupted, rocking back on her heels. "Molly Reed. What's your name?" "Clara." She should refuse the food she knew, should hand it back and walk away before someone saw them together and decided the convicted thief was corrupting the town's children. But her hands wouldn't cooperate. They held on to that bread like it was salvation itself. "Are you hungry, Miss Clara?" Molly tilted her head, studying her with unnerving directness. "You look hungry. My daddy says you can always tell when someone's really hungry because they get a certain look in their eyes, like they're seeing something far away." Clara's vision blurred with unexpected tears. She blinked them back furiously. "I'm fine, but thank you for this. It's very kind." "You can't be fine if you're hungry." Molly's logic was irrefutable. "Why won't Maggie give you food? She gives food to everyone. She even gave food to Mr. Peterson when he couldn't pay, and everyone says he's mean as a rattlesnake." Clara struggled for an explanation that wouldn't frighten the child. "I have a bad reputation. People don't trust me." "Why not?" The simple question hit harder than all of Maggie's accusations. Why not? Because 3 years ago, $200 had gone missing from the strongbox of the Garrett family in Silver Springs. Because Clara had been the last person to see Mrs. Garrett that day. Because Clara was just the governess, just the hired help, and the Garretts were important people with important friends. Because when it came down to a servant's word against a wealthy family's suspicions, the servant always lost. "Because I was accused of something I didn't do," Clara said quietly. "And even after serving time for it, people still think I'm guilty." Molly considered this with the seriousness of a judge. Then she reached out and took Clara's hand. Her small fingers were warm and slightly sticky, and the gesture was so unexpected, so completely trusting, that Clara felt something crack inside her chest. "My mama used to say that people are bad at seeing what's really true," Molly said. "She said they see what they expect to see, not what's actually there. Do you think that's why they can't see you're good? Clara couldn't speak. She knelt down in the dust, not caring about her already filthy skirt, and looked into this child's face. Your mama sounds like she was a very wise woman. She was. Molly's smile faltered for just a moment. She died 3 years ago. I miss her a lot. I'm sorry. Clara squeezed the small hand gently. That must be very hard. It is, but Daddy takes good care of me. He tries really hard, even though I think he's sad all the time. He pretends he's not, but I can tell. Molly brightened suddenly, as if an idea had just occurred to her. Want to meet my daddy? The question hung in the hot air between them. Clara should say no. She should thank this sweet child for her kindness, take the bread and cheese, and disappear down the road before anyone noticed they were talking. Getting involved with anyone, forming any kind of connection, that was how you got hurt. That was how you ended up hoping for things that could never be. But Molly's hand was still in hers, warm and alive and real. And Clara was so tired. Tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of being judged by people who didn't know her story. What would it hurt to meet this child's father, thank him for raising such a kind-hearted daughter, and then move on? I don't want to impose, Clara said carefully. Your father might not. He won't mind. He likes meeting people. And our ranch is only about a mile from here. You could rest in the shade, get some water from the pump. Please? Molly's eyes widened with hope. I never get to meet new people. Everyone in town is old and boring. Despite everything, Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. I'm probably old and boring too. You're not. You're interesting. You've been places. I can tell. Molly started pulling gently on Clara's hand. Come on, just for a little while. You can have real water, not just from the trough like the horses. Clara looked back at the town of Red Hollow, at the dusty street and the closed doors and the people who'd already decided who she was. Then she looked at Molly, at this unexpected light in the darkness of her afternoon. All right, she heard herself say, just for a little while. Molly's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? Oh, you're going to love our place. Well, it's not fancy or anything, but Daddy keeps it nice. And we have chickens. Do you like chickens? I have a favorite one named Butterscotch because she's yellow. The girl started walking, still holding Clara's hand, chattering away about chickens and ranch life and how she was learning to read from an old primer her mother had used. Clara followed, the bread and cheese clutched in her other hand, wondering what in heaven's name she was doing. The road out of Red Hollow was rough and winding, cutting through scrubland dotted with sage and the occasional twisted pine. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, but Molly seemed unbothered, skipping ahead and then circling back, pointing out landmarks and telling stories with the inexhaustible energy of childhood. That's where I found a snakeskin last month, the biggest one ever. And over there, that's where the wild horses sometimes come down to drink from the creek. Daddy says we're lucky to have water on our land because lots of ranches don't. The creek comes down from the mountains and it runs all year, even when it doesn't rain much. Clara let the words wash over her, grateful for the distraction from her own spiraling thoughts. What would she say to this man when she met him? How would she explain why a strange woman had followed his daughter home like a stray dog? Would he recognize her face, know her history? Does he come into town often? Clara asked, trying to sound casual. Not really. He likes the ranch better. He says town people talk too much and work too little. Molly grinned. But he goes to church on Sundays sometimes, and he gets supplies from Mr. Henderson's store. Mr. Henderson doesn't gossip like the others. Daddy likes that. They crested a small hill, and suddenly the land opened up before them. A valley stretched out below, green in a way Clara hadn't seen since leaving the last town. She could see the glint of water cutting through the center, the creek Molly had mentioned. And there, nestled against the far side of the valley, was a ranch. It wasn't large or impressive, but it was well maintained, a 2-story house with a wide porch, painted white with dark green shutters, a barn that looked sturdy and relatively new, a chicken coop, a small stable, fenced pastures where a few horses grazed, clotheslines strung between posts, laundry moving gently in the breeze Clara couldn't feel from this distance. That's home, Molly announced proudly. Come on! They descended into the valley, and as they got closer, Clara could see more details. The flower boxes under the windows were empty, but well built. The porch had a rocking chair that looked handmade. Everything spoke of careful attention, of someone who took pride in their property even if they lived alone with a small child. As they approached the house, a man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore simple work clothes, a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled up, brown pants, worn boots. When he saw them approaching, his expression shifted from neutral to confused to concerned in rapid succession. "Molly, what?" His eyes moved from his daughter to Clara, taking in her bedraggled appearance, the way she was clearly a stranger. His body language changed subtly, becoming protective. "Who's this?" "Daddy, this is Miss Clara. She came from town and she was hungry and nobody would help her, so I invited her to meet you. She's nice, I can tell." Molly spoke in a rush, as if afraid her father might interrupt before she finished her explanation. Thomas Reed, for this had to be him, looked at Clara with eyes that were wary but not unkind. They were blue, she noticed, the kind of blue that might have been warm once but had learned to guard itself. "Miss," he said, nodding slightly, "I'm Thomas Reed. I apologize if my daughter bothered you." "She didn't," Clara said quickly. "She was very kind, actually. More kind than—" She stopped herself, not wanting to complain about the town to this man who presumably had to live alongside those people. "I should go. I only walked her back to make sure she got home safe. I didn't mean to intrude." "You came from town?" Thomas's eyes sharpened. "On foot?" "Yes, I was passing through." "In this heat?" He glanced at the sky, at the sun still blazing overhead. "That's a dangerous walk without water." "I had water." The lie came automatically. "I'm fine, really. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Reed." Clara started to turn away, but Molly's hand tightened on hers. "Daddy, she needs water, real water, and maybe she could rest in the shade for a bit, please?" Molly looked up at her father with an expression that clearly said she would not take no for an answer. Thomas studied his daughter's face, then looked back at Clara. His expression was unreadable. "The pump's around the side of the house," he said finally. "You're welcome to drink your fill, and there's shade on the porch if you need to rest before you head out again." It was reluctant hospitality, offered more for his daughter's sake than out of any desire to welcome a stranger, but it was more than Clara had received anywhere else that day. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I won't stay long." She followed Molly around the side of the house, acutely aware of Thomas watching them go. The pump was exactly where he'd said it would be, a well-maintained mechanism next to a water trough. Molly worked the handle while Clara cupped her hands, and when the water finally came, it was cold and clear and tasted like salvation. She drank until her stomach hurt, until the desperate thirst that had been her companion for miles finally eased. Then she splashed water on her face and neck, feeling human again for the first time since morning. "Better?" Molly asked, grinning. "Much better. Thank you, Molly, for everything." Clara straightened, preparing to make her exit before she overstayed the grudging welcome. But Molly had other ideas. "You should see the chickens! Come on, they're really funny, Butterscotch especially. She doesn't like the rooster and she pecks at him when he gets bossy." Before Clara could protest, she found herself being pulled toward the chicken coop. And somehow, standing in the shade watching a yellow hen terrorize a rooster twice her size while Molly narrated the ongoing drama, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Lightness. Just for a moment, just for a breath, the weight of her past and her uncertain future lifted. She didn't notice Thomas approaching until he spoke. "She likes you." Clara turned, startled. Thomas stood a few feet away, his expression still guarded but less hostile than before. "She's a wonderful child," Clara said honestly. "You should be very proud." "I am." Something softened in his face when he looked at his daughter. She doesn't usually take to strangers. After her mother died, she got real quiet for a long time. Didn't talk to anyone outside our property for almost a year. So if she brought you all the way out here, she must have seen something in you worth knowing. The words hit Clara harder than they should have. Worth knowing. When was the last time anyone had looked at her and seen something worth knowing? "I should go," Clara said again, but her feet didn't move. "I don't want to impose on your hospitality." "Where are you headed?" The question was simple, but Clara had no good answer. Where was she headed? To the next town, and the one after that, and the one after that? To nowhere in particular, and everywhere all at once? North, she said vaguely. There might be work in some of the mining towns. Thomas nodded slowly. Then, you look like you haven't eaten in a while. Clara's pride wanted her to deny it, but her growling stomach betrayed her. She'd eaten the bread and cheese while walking, but it hadn't been enough to erase the hollow feeling of real hunger. I'm managing, she said instead. Molly, Thomas called to his daughter. Go inside and set an extra plate for supper and wash up. You're covered in dust. Really, Mr. Reed, that's not necessary. It's nearly dark, Thomas interrupted, looking at the sky. And storms roll through these parts fast this time of year. You can eat, rest a bit, and head out in the morning when it's cooler. Safer that way. Clara stared at him, trying to understand this grudging kindness from a man who clearly wasn't comfortable with strangers. Why would you do that? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. My wife used to say that we're all just one bad day away from needing mercy. I figure if someone shows up at my door in need, I can spare a meal and a night's shelter. It's the decent thing to do. But you don't know me. I could be a lot of things, Thomas agreed. But my daughter trusts you, and Molly's got better instincts about people than most adults I know. So, one night, then you can be on your way. It wasn't warm. It wasn't even particularly friendly. But it was offered honestly, and right then, that meant everything. Thank you, Clara whispered. You have no idea what this means. Thomas nodded once, then turned back toward the barn. Supper's at sundown. Make yourself useful if you want. There's always work to be done on a ranch. And just like that, Clara found herself standing in the yard of the Reed Ranch, watching a little girl chase chickens and a widower disappear into his barn, wondering how a single question, "Want to meet my daddy?" had led her to this moment, to this fragile possibility of something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Refuge, however temporary it might be. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Clara looked at the house, at the barn, at the valley spread out before her. Tomorrow she would leave. Tomorrow she would go back to being a woman without a place in the world. But tonight she would accept this gift of mercy from strangers who owed her nothing. Tonight she would let herself imagine that belonging was possible, even if only for a few hours. The screen door opened and Molly's head popped out. Miss Clara, come help me set the table, and you can tell me about all the places you've been. Clara smiled, a real smile, the first one all day, and walked toward the house. Behind her, the first rumble of distant thunder rolled across the valley. Storms were coming. She had no idea how right she was. The storm broke just as they sat down to eat, rain hammering against the windows with a violence that made the glass shudder in its frames. Clara had helped Molly set the table. Simple wooden plates, mismatched utensils, cups that had once been part of a nicer set, but now stood alone, survivors of whatever had broken the others. The kitchen was clean but sparse, functional rather than comfortable. Everything spoke of a man doing his best with limited resources and even more limited time. Thomas had made stew, thick with vegetables and chunks of beef that had simmered all day. The smell alone made Clara's mouth water. He served it without ceremony, ladling generous portions into each bowl, then cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread that looked store-bought but was still better than anything Clara had eaten in weeks. We say grace first, Molly announced, reaching for Clara's hand on one side and her father's on the other. Clara's stomach twisted with discomfort. She'd spent 18 months in prison listening to chaplains talk about redemption and forgiveness, while the system that imprisoned her saw neither. She'd stopped believing in the comfort of ritual, in the idea that words spoken over food could make any real difference in a world that ran on cruelty and chance. But she bowed her head anyway, not wanting to disrespect this family's traditions in their own home. Thomas's grace was brief and matter-of-fact. For this food and this shelter and this day that we made it through, we're grateful. Amen. It wasn't flowery or elaborate, just a simple acknowledgement of survival. Somehow, that made it more bearable. Amen, Molly echoed, then immediately grabbed her spoon. Can Miss Clara tell us about her travels while we eat? Please, Daddy? Thomas glanced at Clara, his expression unreadable. Only if she wants to. A person's business is their own. Clara took a bite of stew, buying herself time to think. The food was good, really good, seasoned carefully and cooked with patience. It tasted like someone who actually cared about the result, not just the necessity of eating. There's not much to tell, she said carefully. I've been traveling for about 2 years now, working odd jobs where I can find them. Most towns don't want strangers staying too long. Why not? Molly asked around a mouthful of bread. Molly, don't talk with your mouth full, Thomas corrected gently. The girl swallowed dramatically. Sorry, but why don't they want strangers, Miss Clara? People are afraid of what they don't know, Clara said slowly. They think if they don't know your family or your history, you might be dangerous, or you might take something from them. So it's easier to just turn people away than to take a chance. That seems mean. It does, Clara agreed. But sometimes people have good reasons to be cautious. Bad things happen, and they want to protect what's theirs. Thomas was watching her with those careful blue eyes, and Clara had the uncomfortable feeling he could see right through her vague explanations to the truth underneath. But he didn't press, just continued eating his stew in measured bites. Did you have a family? Molly asked, her natural curiosity undaunted by adult discomfort with personal questions. Before you started traveling? Clara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. I did. My parents died when I was young. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I had an older brother, but he went west to try his luck in the gold fields. I haven't heard from him in almost 10 years. That's sad, Molly said with the blunt empathy of childhood. Were you lonely? Sometimes. Clara forced herself to keep eating, though the food had lost some of its appeal as memories she usually kept buried began to surface. But I found work as a governess, teaching children. That helped. What's a governess? Molly leaned forward, interested. Someone who lives with a family and teaches their children, reading, writing, arithmetic, sometimes music or art. It's like being a teacher, but you live in the house with the family you work for. That sounds nice. Did you like it? Clara thought about the Garrett family, about the 2 children she genuinely cared for, about Mrs. Garrett's coldness and Mr. Garrett's wandering hands that she'd learned to avoid, about the day the money went missing and how quickly affection had turned to accusation. Parts of it, she said neutrally. Thomas cleared his throat. Molly, let Miss Clara eat her supper in peace. You can talk her ear off after we're done. But I want to know more about Molly. Thomas's voice was firm but not harsh. We have a guest. That means we practice hospitality, which includes not interrogating her like a circuit judge. Molly subsided, though her expression suggested this was only a temporary retreat. Clara felt a rush of gratitude toward Thomas for creating space she desperately needed. They ate in silence for a while, accompanied only by the sound of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Clara tried not to eat too quickly, tried not to show how hungry she really was, but the warmth and safety of the kitchen combined with actual food made it difficult to maintain dignity. She ended up accepting a second helping when Thomas offered it without comment, and when she finally set down her spoon, she felt more human than she had in months. Thank you, she said quietly. That was excellent. Thomas nodded once, acknowledging the compliment. Coffee? If it's not too much trouble. He rose and moved to the stove where a battered pot sat warming. As he poured 3 cups, adding generous milk to Molly's, Clara took the opportunity to really look at him. He moved with the economy of someone used to living alone, each gesture efficient and practiced. His hands were scarred and calloused from hard work, but they handled the cups with surprising care. There was a weariness to him that went deeper than physical exhaustion, a heaviness that Clara recognized because she carried it herself. This was a man who had learned to function through grief, she realized, who had figured out how to make meals and raise a child and run a ranch while carrying a weight that never truly lifted. She wondered what his wife had been like, this woman Molly missed, and Thomas never mentioned. Miss Clara, you can sleep in the guest room, Molly announced, apparently having forgiven the earlier restrictions on her questioning. It's upstairs next to my room. We don't usually have guests, so it might be dusty, but Daddy keeps the bed made just in case. Just in case of what? Clara asked. Molly shrugged. That's what Mama used to say. Always keep the guest room ready, just in case someone needs shelter. She said you never know when you might be entertaining angels unaware. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Clara sensed she'd stumbled onto painful ground, his wife's words still echoing in this house 3 years after her death. "That's very kind," Clara said carefully, "but I don't want to impose more than necessary. I can sleep in the barn if—" "Guest room's already made up," Thomas interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Storm's getting worse. You'll stay inside." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly vicious crack of thunder shook the house, followed by a flash of lightning that briefly turned the kitchen as bright as day. Molly jumped slightly, then tried to pretend she hadn't. "I'm not scared," she declared. "Storms don't bother me." "Of course not," Clara said gravely. "You're very brave." Mama used to say storms were just the sky cleaning itself, getting rid of all the dust and heat so things could grow fresh and new. Molly traced patterns on the table with her finger. "Do you think that's true, Miss Clara?" Clara thought about the storms in her own life, the accusations, the trial, the prison, the endless wandering. Had any of it cleaned anything? Had any of it led to fresh growth? Or had it just been destruction for destruction's sake? "I think sometimes things need to be washed away before new things can grow," she said slowly. "But I also think storms can be hard to live through, even if they serve a purpose." Molly considered this with her usual seriousness. Then she yawned, a jaw-cracking yawn that she tried unsuccessfully to hide behind her hand. "Bedtime?" Thomas said, standing. "Go wash up and put on your nightgown. I'll be up in a few minutes to check on you." "But I want to talk to Miss Clara more." "Tomorrow. If the storm's passed, you can show her around the ranch before she leaves. But right now, it's bedtime." Molly looked like she wanted to argue, but something in her father's expression stopped her. Instead, she turned to Clara. "Will you be here in the morning? Promise?" The question carried more weight than it should have. Claire could see Thomas tense slightly, waiting for her answer. They both knew she'd planned to leave at first light, to thank them for their hospitality and disappear back into the anonymity of the road. But looking into Molly's hopeful face, Clara found herself nodding. "I promise. I'll be here when you wake up." Molly's smile could have lit the whole valley. "Good. I have so much to show you. Good night, Miss Clara. Good night, Daddy." She bounded out of the kitchen and up the stairs, her footsteps thundering overhead. Thomas listened until he heard the sound of water running in the washroom, then began clearing the table. "You don't have to promise her things," he said quietly, his back to Clara as he scraped plates into a bucket for the chickens. "She'll be disappointed when you're gone, but she'll understand. She knows people leave." The words stung more than they should have. "I wasn't planning to. I will leave. Soon. But I can stay long enough to say goodbye properly. She deserves that much." Thomas turned, studying her face with those two perceptive eyes. "What are you running from?" Clara's breath caught. "I'm not running from anything. Everyone who walks the roads like you do is running from something or toward something, usually from." He set the plates in the basin, then turned to face her fully. "And before you came into my house and sat at my table and made promises to my daughter, I should have asked, so I'm asking now. What did you do?" The question was direct enough to be uncomfortable but not hostile. Thomas Reed, Clara realized, was the kind of man who needed to know the truth before he could decide what to do with it. She could lie. She'd gotten good at lying, at giving partial truths that satisfied curiosity without revealing anything real. But something about this kitchen, this storm, this quiet man who had offered shelter when he didn't have to, it demanded honesty. "I was a governess in Silver Springs, about 80 miles east of here," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the way her hands trembled in her lap. 3 years ago, money went missing from the family's strongbox. $200. They accused me of taking it." "Did you?" "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "I didn't steal anything, but I was the last person seen near the study where the strongbox was kept, and when they searched my room, they found $20 hidden in my trunk, money I'd been saving from my wages, but they said it proved I was a thief. My word against theirs. The jury believed them." Thomas was quiet, his expression unreadable. Clara forced herself to continue. "I served 18 months. When I got out, I tried to go back to teaching, but no one would hire me. Tried to find any work at all, but my name had been in the papers. Everyone knew. So I started traveling, taking work where I could find it, moving on when people recognized me. She met his eyes, refusing to look away. That's who you invited into your home. A convicted thief. I understand if you want me to leave now, storm or no storm. The silence stretched out between them, filled only by rain and distant thunder. Clara waited for the judgment, the coldness, the order to get out. She'd seen it enough times to know what came next. But Thomas surprised her. You didn't take that money, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Clara blinked. I just told you. I heard what you told me. I'm saying I don't think you took it. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I've known actual thieves. They don't look like you. They don't carry themselves the way you do. And they sure as hell don't follow little girls home just to make sure they're safe. You don't know me, Clara whispered. You can't possibly... I know enough. I know my daughter's instincts, and she saw something good in you. I know you are more concerned about imposing on my hospitality than about where your next meal would come from. I know you promised to stay for breakfast, even though it'll make leaving harder. He paused. And I know what it looks like when someone's been judged unfairly. The law isn't always just, Miss Wynne. Sometimes it's just convenient. The use of her last name startled her. She hadn't told him her full name. He must have heard it in town, or remembered it from old wanted posters. But there was no accusation in his voice, just a weary acknowledgement of harsh truths. Why would you believe me? Clara asked, genuinely confused. Everyone else, I told you. My wife used to say we're all one bad day away from needing mercy. Thomas's voice softened slightly. She also used to say that the people quickest to judge others are usually the ones most afraid of being judged themselves. I learned to listen to her wisdom. Wish I'd listened better while she was still here to share it. The grief in those last words was raw enough to make Clara look away. She focused on her coffee cup, on the dark liquid inside it, on anything but the sudden vulnerability in this guarded man's face. I'm sorry about your wife, she said quietly. Molly clearly loved her very much. We both did. Thomas cleared his throat, pushing away from the counter. Storm's not letting up. I'll show you to the guest room. Washroom's at the end of the hall if you need it. There should be clean towels in the cabinet. He was closing off again, Clara realized, pulling back from the brief moment of openness. She understood the instinct. She did the same thing herself, all the time. Still, she found herself wishing she could say something, anything, that would let him know she recognized his grief and honored it. But the right words wouldn't come, so she simply followed him up the narrow staircase, their footsteps creaking on the old wood. The second floor was small, just 3 doors along a short hallway. Thomas pointed to each in turn. That's Molly's room. That's mine. And this one's yours for tonight. He opened the third door, revealing a small room with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley. True to Molly's warning, there was a thin layer of dust on the surfaces, but the bed was indeed made up with clean sheets and a faded quilt. A kerosene lamp sat on the dresser next to a basin and pitcher. It's not fancy, Thomas said, almost apologetically. It's perfect, Claire replied honestly. Thank you, Mr. Reed, for all of this. He nodded once, then hesitated in the doorway. You know, you could stay a few days if you wanted. The storm's probably going to wash out some of the roads anyway, make traveling difficult. And I could use help around here. Molly's been after me to hire someone to help with the house and the chickens, maybe do some cooking so I can focus on the ranch work. I can pay wages. Nothing much, but fair. Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. You're offering me work? After what I just told you? I'm offering work to someone who needs it, and who I think would do it well, yes or no? Every instinct Clara had developed over the past 2 years screamed at her to say no. Don't stay. Don't get attached. Don't start hoping for stability when you know it'll just be torn away. Keep moving. Stay safe through motion. But another part of her, a part she'd thought was dead, whispered different counsel. What if you stayed? What if, just this once, you let yourself rest? What if this strange little family is offering exactly what you need? Just a few days? She asked carefully. However long makes sense. For both of us. Thomas shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the prolonged conversation. Think about it. Let me know in the morning. He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed behind him. Clara stood in the center of the small room, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hall, hearing the murmur of his voice as he checked on Molly, the creak of his own door closing. She moved to the window and looked out at the storm-darkened valley. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes, the barn, the fences, the creek running high with rainwater. It was a good piece of land, she thought, the kind of place where you could build something that lasted, if you had the strength and the help to do it. The kind of place she'd never thought she'd see again, much less be invited to stay in. Clara turned from the window and began to undress, her movements mechanical as her mind spun. She washed using the cold water in the pitcher, then slipped into the bed wearing her chemise, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The sheets smelled like lavender and dust, like something that had been carefully preserved but rarely used. The guest room, kept ready just in case someone needed shelter. She thought about Molly's words, about entertaining angels unaware, about Thomas's wife who had apparently believed in radical hospitality even in this harsh land. What kind of woman must she have been? What kind of life had she built here before death took her away? Clara closed her eyes, exhausted but unable to sleep, listening to the storm rage outside. Tomorrow she would have to decide. Stay or go? Accept this unexpected offer or stick to the safety of constant motion? The smart choice was clear. The safe choice was obvious. But somewhere between the diner's rejection and Molly's invitation, between the charity of bread and cheese and Thomas's matter-of-fact belief in her innocence, Clara had started to question whether the smart choice and the right choice were the same thing. She was still questioning when sleep finally claimed her, dragging her down into dreams where she stood at crossroads that stretched endlessly in all directions, trying to decide which way led home. Morning came slowly, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the darkest hours before dawn. Clara woke to unfamiliar sounds, roosters crowing, the low of cattle, footsteps in the kitchen below. For a moment she didn't remember where she was, panic rising in her chest until her eyes focused on the small window and memory returned. The Reed Ranch, Thomas, and Molly. The offer of work. She dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, the only clothes she had, and tried to make herself presentable with the water from the pitcher. Her hair was a lost cause, tangled from days without proper care, but she did her best to braid it back. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman with nothing, dependent on charity. When she came downstairs, she found Thomas already gone and Molly sitting at the kitchen table, swinging her legs and eating what looked like cornmeal mush with honey. "Good morning," Molly chirped, bright-eyed and cheerful despite the early hour. "Daddy's doing the morning chores. He said to tell you there's mush in the pot and coffee on the stove and you should eat before everything gets cold." Clara served herself, grateful for the continued hospitality, even as she wondered how much longer it could last. She sat across from Molly, who immediately launched into an enthusiastic description of everything they would do today now that the storm had passed. "First, I'll show you all the chickens. Not just Butterscotch, but all of them. They all have personalities, you know. And then the horses. We have 3 horses, and they're all really smart. And then maybe we can go down to the creek if Daddy says it's safe after the rain. And then—" "Molly," Clara interrupted gently, "I might not be here for all of that. I was planning to leave this morning." Molly's face fell so dramatically that Clara felt like she'd kicked a puppy. "But you promised you'd be here when I woke up." "And I am. I kept my promise. But I have to keep traveling, sweetheart. I can't stay in one place too long." "Why not?" The simple question deserved a simple answer, but Clara didn't have one. "Because people always find out who I am. Because I can't risk getting comfortable. Because I'm afraid of hoping for something permanent and losing it again." None of those felt appropriate to share with a 7-year-old. "Because that's just how things are right now," she said instead. Molly's expression shifted from disappointed to determined. "Did Daddy offer you the job?" Clara blinked, surprised. "How did you know about that?" "I heard you talking last night. I wasn't spying," Molly added quickly. "I just couldn't sleep because of the thunder, and I came out to ask Daddy to check for monsters under my bed, and I heard him say you could stay and work here." She leaned forward intensely. "Are you going to say yes?" "I don't know. It's complicated." "Why is it complicated? We need help, and you need work. Daddy said so." Out of the mouths of babes, Clara thought. When you stripped away all the fear and self-protection, It really was that simple. They needed help. She needed work. The math wasn't hard, but math didn't account for the risk of staying, of letting these people, this sweet child and her grieving father, get close enough to hurt when Clara inevitably had to leave. Because she would have to leave eventually. People always found out. Her past always caught up. "Let me talk to your father," Clara said finally. "But Molly, you need to understand something. Even if I stay for a little while, I probably can't stay forever. At some point, I'll have to move on. That's just reality." "But maybe you won't have to," Molly said stubbornly. "Maybe this time it'll be different." Clara didn't have the heart to explain that it never was. Thomas returned as they were finishing breakfast, bringing with him the smell of hay and animals and fresh air. He nodded to Clara, then ruffled his daughter's hair. "Morning. Storm do any damage?" Clara asked. "Lost part of a fence in the north pasture. Nothing major." He poured himself coffee, then turned to look at her directly. "You still planning to leave today?" Molly watched them both with wide, hopeful eyes. Clara took a breath. Smart choice or right choice? Safe choice or honest choice? She'd spent 2 years choosing safety, and where had it gotten her? Alone, hungry, desperate, and exhausted. "If the offer's still good," she heard herself say, "I'd like to stay, for a little while. See how it works out." Molly's squeal of delight was loud enough to wake any creatures still sleeping in the county. She launched herself at Clara with the full force of her small body, wrapping skinny arms around Clara's waist. "You're staying! You're really staying! I knew you would! I knew it!" Thomas's expression didn't change much, but Clara thought she saw something ease in his shoulders, some tension she hadn't even noticed dissipating. "All right then," he said simply. "Welcome to the Reed Ranch, Miss Wynne. Let's talk terms." They worked it out over the next hour. Clara would help with cooking, cleaning, mending, tending the chickens and the kitchen garden. She'd get room and board plus a small wage paid weekly. Either party could end the arrangement with a day's notice. It was businesslike and fair, nothing sentimental about it. But when Molly grabbed her hand and pulled her outside to start the promised tour, chattering nonstop about everything they would do together, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Not certainty. She was too familiar with disappointment for that. But possibility. The faint, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this strange turn of events could lead somewhere good. She had no idea how right she was, or how much more complicated it would become. But for now, in the clear morning after the storm, with a child's hand warm in hers and honest work waiting, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe Molly was right. Maybe this time would be different. The first week passed in a blur of work and adjustment. Clara threw herself into the rhythm of ranch life with a determination that bordered on desperate. She woke before dawn to start the stove and make breakfast. She collected eggs, fed chickens, weeded the kitchen garden that had grown wild in the years since Thomas's wife had tended it. She scrubbed floors and washed clothes and mended shirts that had been patched so many times they were more repair than original fabric. Thomas watched her with those careful blue eyes, but said little. He was a man of few words, Clara learned quickly. He gave instructions once and expected them to be remembered. He didn't hover or criticize, but he noticed everything. When the coffee was stronger, when the bread rose higher, when the chickens started laying more consistently because their feed schedule had been regularized. "You're good at this," he said one evening as they stood on the porch after Molly had gone to bed. It was the first real compliment he'd given, and Clara felt it settle warm in her chest. "I had good training," she replied. "My mother taught me to run a household before she died, and I learned more as a governess. The Garretts expected me to help with household management when I wasn't teaching the children." Thomas nodded slowly. "They were fools to accuse you. Their loss." The simple statement of faith in her innocence shouldn't have meant as much as it did, but Clara found herself blinking back unexpected tears, grateful for the darkness that hid her face. "Thank you for saying that. Just truth." Thomas shifted his weight, uncomfortable with emotional directness. "You planning to stay past the trial period?" They'd agreed on 2 weeks initially, a test run to see if the arrangement worked for both of them. That time was nearly up. "If you'll have me," Clara said quietly, "the work suits me. And Molly thinks you hung the moon," Thomas interrupted, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. Haven't seen her this happy since before her mama died. That's worth something. She's a special child. You've done well with her. I've done what I could. But a girl needs more than a grieving father can give." He paused, then added carefully, "She needs someone who can teach her things. Woman things. How to be in the world. You're good at that." It was the most he'd said at once since she'd arrived, and Clara understood what it cost him to admit he needed help, that he couldn't do everything alone. "I'll stay then," she said, "as long as it works for both of us." Thomas nodded once, satisfied, and that was that. No formal contract, no elaborate discussion, just an agreement between two people who'd found themselves unexpectedly necessary to each other. The days developed their own rhythm after that. Clara began to feel less like a temporary guest and more like part of the household. She learned that Thomas liked his coffee black and strong, that Molly would eat vegetables without complaint if they were hidden in soup, that the house creaked in certain ways when wind came from the north. She learned which floorboards squeaked and how to avoid them when checking on Molly at night. She learned that Thomas sometimes couldn't sleep and would sit on the porch for hours, staring out at the valley as if waiting for something that would never come. She learned, too, that there were parts of the house she wasn't allowed to touch. It happened 2 weeks into her stay, when she was doing a thorough cleaning of the downstairs rooms. She'd been working her way through the parlor, a room that clearly saw little use, when she noticed a rocking chair positioned by the window. It was beautiful, made of dark wood with delicate carved details, and obviously well-maintained despite the dust that covered everything else in the room. Without thinking, Clara reached out to dust it. "Don't!" Thomas's voice came from the doorway, sharp enough to make her jump. She turned to find him standing there, his expression harder than she'd ever seen it. "I'm sorry, I was just—" "Leave it alone." He crossed the room in 3 strides and positioned himself between Clara and the chair, as if protecting it from her. "That chair doesn't get touched, or moved, or dusted. It stays exactly as it is." Clara stepped back, hands raised in surrender. "Of course. I didn't know. I'm sorry." Thomas's jaw worked, and for a moment she thought he might explain, but then the hardness in his face shifted into something more familiar, the careful blankness he wore when emotion threatened to surface. "Just leave this room alone. I'll handle it when it needs handling." He left without another word, and Clara stood alone in the dusty parlor, staring at the untouched rocking chair and understanding with sudden, painful clarity this had been his wife's chair. This whole room, probably, had been hers, and Thomas had preserved it exactly as she'd left it, unable or unwilling to let any part of her go. Clara finished her cleaning in the other rooms, but her mind kept returning to that chair, to the rawness in Thomas's voice, to the grief that obviously still lived in this house like an uninvited guest. That night, after Molly was asleep, Clara found Thomas on the porch again. He didn't acknowledge her presence when she sat in the other chair, but he didn't send her away either. "Her name was Elizabeth," he said finally, his voice low. "Everyone called her Beth. She loved that chair. Her father made it for her when we got married. She'd sit there in the evenings and sew, or read, or just look out at the valley. Said it was her favorite spot in the whole house." Clara waited, sensing there was more. "She died in the winter 3 years ago, fell through ice on the creek. By the time I found her—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Molly was 4, too young to really understand. She just knew Mama wasn't coming home." "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered. I can't imagine. I've kept that room the way it was. Haven't touched anything. Keep thinking someday I'll be ready to pack it up, to move on. But every time I try, I just can't." He turned to look at her, his eyes shadowed in the darkness. "Does that make me weak?" "No," Clara said firmly. "It makes you human. Love doesn't die just because the person does. You carry it forward, and sometimes that means keeping spaces sacred to their memory." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Beth would have liked you. She had a thing about helping people who needed it, who'd been treated unfairly. She'd have brought you home herself if she'd seen you in that diner." The compliment settled warm in Clara's chest. "I wish I could have known her." "Me too. She'd know what to do about all this." He gestured vaguely at the house, at the valley, at the complicated situation they'd found themselves in. She always knew what to do. I'm just making it up as I go. From where I'm standing, you're doing a good job. Thomas huffed something that might have been a laugh. You're kind to say so, but I know my limitations. I can run a ranch and raise a daughter, but I can't do everything. That's why I needed help, why I needed you. The admission cost him something. Clara could hear it in his voice. Thomas Reed was a man who'd learned to stand alone, who'd survived by not needing anyone. Acknowledging that he needed help was a vulnerability he didn't wear comfortably. I'm glad I stayed, Clara said quietly. I almost didn't. I almost left that first morning. Why didn't you? Molly, and you, and the fact that running hasn't actually solved any of my problems. It's just made them easier to ignore. She paused. Also, this is the first place in 2 years that's felt anything like home. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding. They sat in companionable silence after that, listening to night sounds, crickets, distant cattle, the rustle of wind through grass. It wasn't uncomfortable, this silence. It was the kind of quiet that existed between people who'd started to trust each other, who didn't need words to fill every moment. Eventually, Thomas rose, stretching stiff muscles. I'm glad you stayed too, he said simply. Good night, Miss Wynne. Clara, you can call me Clara. He paused, considering. Clara, then. Good night. Good night, Thomas. She heard his sharp intake of breath at the use of his first name, saw the slight smile that crossed his face before he turned away. It felt like something had shifted between them, some invisible line crossed. They weren't quite friends yet. Too much remained unspoken, too many walls still stood. But they were something more than employer and employee now. They were two people who'd been broken by life, trying to figure out how to build something new from the pieces that remained. Clara sat on the porch long after Thomas had gone inside, looking out at the valley under its blanket of stars. Somewhere out there, her past waited. The accusations, the conviction, the judgment of people who didn't know her. It would catch up eventually, it always did. But for now, for tonight, she allowed herself to simply be here. To be Clara, who cooked and cleaned and made a little girl laugh. To be part of something larger than her own survival. To be, however temporarily, home. She had no idea that in a dusty barn loft, hidden among old tools and forgotten equipment, a journal waited to be discovered. A journal that would crack open secrets best left buried, and transform her temporary refuge into something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But that discovery was still weeks away. For now, Clara simply went to bed, fell asleep in clean sheets in a house that smelled like family, and dreamed of futures that might actually be possible. The journal found Clara rather than the other way around. It was a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after her arrival, the kind of late summer day where heat built slowly and promised to be merciless by afternoon. Thomas had asked her to organize the barn loft, a task he'd been putting off for months, maybe years. The loft had become a catch-all for broken equipment, old furniture, and the accumulated debris of a life that had been interrupted by tragedy and never quite resumed its normal course. Clara had been grateful for the project. It gave her something concrete to do, something with a clear beginning and end. She'd been feeling restless lately, aware that she'd been at the ranch for almost 2 months and had yet to encounter any of the problems that usually drove her away. No suspicious looks from neighbors. No questions about her past. No sudden recognition that led to whispers and accusations. It was almost too good, and that made her nervous. In Clara's experience, peace never lasted. She'd been moving an old trunk, surprisingly heavy for its size, when it caught on something and tipped, spilling its contents across the loft floor. Blankets mostly, and some old clothes that moths had gotten to. But wedged in the corner of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth as if someone had meant to protect it, was a leather-bound book. Clara picked it up carefully, brushing dust from the cover. There was no title, no name, just plain brown leather worn soft with handling. She shouldn't open it. She knew that instinctively. This was private, someone's personal writing, and she had no right to intrude. But her fingers were already working at the oilcloth, already opening the cover to the first page. And there, in careful, feminine handwriting, she read, "This journal belongs to Elizabeth Margaret Reed. If found, please return to the ranch on Cedar Valley Road. Private and personal. Do not read." Clara should have closed it immediately. Should have taken it straight to Thomas and explained where she'd found it. Should have respected the dead woman's privacy. Instead, she turned to the next page. The early entries were mundane, notes about household expenses, recipes, observations about Molly's development. Elizabeth had been a thoughtful writer, her words measured and precise. She recorded the small details of ranch life with an attention that suggested she found meaning in the everyday. Clara found herself drawn into this woman's world, understanding for the first time what Thomas had lost. Then the tone changed. It was subtle at first, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But Clara had learned to read between lines, to catch the things people didn't quite say. And what Elizabeth wasn't quite saying was that she was afraid. March 15th, 1884. Thomas went to town today for supplies. While he was gone, a man came to the ranch. He said he was surveying for the county, but he asked strange questions about our water rights and how long we'd owned the land. He made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't say exactly why. I didn't mention it to Thomas when he returned. He has enough to worry about. Clara's pulse quickened. She flipped forward, scanning entries. April 2nd, 1884. The same man came back. This time he brought another man with him. Older, well-dressed, carrying papers. They said there was a dispute about our land deed, something about unclear boundaries with the property to the west. They wanted to see our documentation. I told them Thomas handles all legal matters, and they'd need to speak with him. The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said they'd be back. April 20th, 1884. Thomas went to the county office today to check on our deed. He came home troubled but wouldn't tell me why. When I pressed, he said it was nothing, just a clerical error that needed fixing. But I saw his hands shaking when he poured his coffee. Thomas never shakes. Clara's mouth went dry. She sat down hard on an old crate, the journal clutched in her hands, reading faster now. May 10th, 1884. I can't shake the feeling we're being watched. Yesterday I saw someone on horseback on the ridge overlooking our property, just sitting there looking down at the house. When I mentioned it to Thomas, he got angry, not at me, but at the situation. He finally admitted that someone is trying to buy our land, and when he refused to sell, they started making threats. Legal threats, he says. Claims that our deed is invalid, that the boundaries are wrong, that we don't own what we think we own. May 28, 1884. Thomas hired a lawyer in Red Hollow. It's costing money we don't have, but he says we need legal representation. The lawyer's name is James Carlyle. He seems competent, but I don't trust him. Maybe I don't trust anyone anymore. June 15th, 1884. I went to town alone today while Thomas was mending fence. I needed to understand what's happening, so I went to the county records office. The clerk was suspicious at first, but I told him I was researching property history for a school project. He showed me the deed books. Our land is there, recorded properly, but I noticed something odd. There are at least 5 other properties in the valley with similar disputes noted in the margins, all within the past 2 years, all owned by small ranchers, all being challenged by the same company, Western Valley Holdings. Clara's breath caught. She'd heard that name before. Where? It nagged at her, just out of reach. July 4th, 1884. I've been making my own inquiries, quietly. I've learned that Western Valley Holdings is owned by a consortium of investors, but the actual decision-makers are a small group of men from Red Hollow. I recognize 2 of the names, Martin Garrett and Harrison Webb. Garrett is on the town council. Webb owns the bank. These are powerful men, and they want something in this valley badly enough to systematically steal it from people who can't afford to fight back. Martin Garrett. Clara's vision blurred. Martin Garrett of Silver Springs? Could it be the same man? The father of the family she'd worked for, the man whose missing money had sent her to prison? Her hands trembled as she turned pages, now desperate to understand. August 1st, 1884. I've discovered something terrible. While researching at the county office, I found records of other governesses, servants, and hired help who've been accused of theft in the past 3 years. Always in families connected to Western Valley Holdings. Always right before those families faced financial pressure or legal disputes. I can barely write this. I think they're manufacturing criminals to discredit witnesses or create leverage. Clara felt the world tilt sideways. The words on the page swam before her eyes. August 15th, 1884. I confronted our lawyer, Carlyle, with what I'd learned. He denied everything, but I saw the truth in his face. He's part of it. They've infiltrated the legal system itself. I'm gathering documentation, hiding copies where they won't think to look. I need proof before I can go to authorities outside Red Hollow. But I'm running out of time. Thomas has been asked to sign papers that Carlyle assures him are routine legal documents to clarify our deed. But I've seen similar papers in the county records. Once signed, they transfer property rights without the owner fully understanding what they've agreed to. September 2nd, 1884. Thomas signed the papers. He came home looking relieved, said Carlyle assured him this would resolve everything. I couldn't tell him the truth. How do you tell your husband he's been betrayed by the man he trusted to protect him? That he's just signed away his land? I've hidden copies of everything I've found in the loft, wrapped in oilcloth inside my old trunk. If anything happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. The entries ended there, abruptly, mid-crisis. Clara checked the date of the last entry, September 2nd, 1884. Elizabeth had died that December, 4 months after realizing the trap they'd walked into. 4 months of carrying that terrible knowledge alone. Clara's mind raced, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Elizabeth had discovered a conspiracy to steal land from small ranchers. She'd realized the legal system was compromised. She'd hidden documentation as evidence. And then she'd died in what everyone called an accident, falling through ice on the creek. But what if it hadn't been an accident? Clara stood abruptly, the journal clutched to her chest, and nearly collided with Thomas, who was climbing up the ladder into the loft. I heard something fall, he said, his eyes moving from her face to the book in her hands. What's that? Clara's mouth opened, but no words came. How could she explain? How could she tell him that his wife had discovered something dangerous, that the papers he'd signed had been part of a fraud, that everything he thought he knew about her death might be a lie? It's Beth's journal, she finally managed. I found it in a trunk. Thomas, you need to read this. You read my wife's private journal? His voice was dangerously quiet. I didn't mean to. I opened it before I realized what it was, and then I saw... Thomas, this is important. She discovered something about your land, about the men who... Give it to me. He held out his hand, his expression hard as stone. Clara handed it over, feeling like she'd just betrayed both of them. Thomas took the journal carefully, almost reverently, then turned and descended the ladder without another word. She found him an hour later on the porch, the journal open on his lap, his face gray as ash. He didn't look up when she sat down beside him. You read all of it? His voice was hoarse. Yes. I'm sorry. I should have stopped, but once I started, I couldn't. She knew. Thomas's hands tightened on the journal. She knew what they'd done, and she never told me. She tried to protect me, and it killed her. You don't know that. The ice... She was terrified of that creek, Thomas interrupted. Wouldn't go near it in winter. Said the ice was too unpredictable. I always thought she was being overly cautious, but she never went down there alone when it was frozen. Never. He turned to look at Clara, and his eyes were haunted. Someone made sure she went down there that day. Someone who knew she'd found out too much. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Murder. That's what he was suggesting, that his wife had been murdered to silence her. The papers you signed, Clara said carefully. Do you still have copies? Carlyle kept all the originals, said it was standard practice. Thomas laughed bitterly. I trusted him. Beth tried to tell me something was wrong that night, tried to get me to wait before signing, but I was so sure she was just being worried for nothing. I told her Carlyle knew what he was doing, that I trusted him. His voice broke. I signed away our land because I was too proud to listen to my wife's instincts. Clara reached out, almost touching his arm, then stopped. You didn't know. How could you have known? She knew. That's what kills me. She figured it out, and I was too blind to see what was right in front of me. He closed the journal with shaking hands. Western Valley Holdings, Martin Garrett, Harrison Webb. These are the men who come to church on Sundays and serve on town councils. These are the men who everyone respects. Elizabeth mentioned documentation, Clara said quietly. She said she hid copies in the loft. We should look, Thomas corrected. If there's evidence up there, we need to find it, together. They climbed back up to the loft, this time working side by side, carefully unpacking the trunk where Clara had found the journal. Beneath the blankets and moth-eaten clothes, wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth, they found a leather portfolio tied with string. Thomas's hands shook as he untied it. Inside were documents, copies of deeds, legal filings, correspondence. Elizabeth had been meticulous, organizing everything by property, dating each document, making notes in the margins in her careful handwriting. And there, near the bottom of the stack, Clara saw her own name. Her breath stopped. She pulled the document free, her vision narrowing to the words on the page. It was a legal complaint filed against her in Silver Springs, dated 3 years earlier. The signature at the bottom authorized her arrest for theft. Thomas Reed, acting as deputy legal representative for Martin Garrett. The world seemed to tilt and spin. Clara looked at Thomas, who was staring at the document with an expression of dawning horror. "That's not my signature," he said immediately. "I never signed anything for Martin Garrett. I've never even met the man." But it looked like his signature. Clara had seen him sign receipts and notes dozens of times over the past weeks. The handwriting was close enough to be convincing to anyone who didn't know better. "They forged it," Clara whispered. "They forged your signature to authorize my arrest. But why? What did I have to do with any of this?" Thomas was flipping through other documents now, his face growing paler with each page. "Here," he said hoarsely, "your family. Wynn. There's a property deed here for land in Silver Springs, owned by Robert and Catherine Wynn. Your parents?" Clara took the document with numb fingers. Yes. That was her parents' land. The small farm where she'd grown up, where they'd died when she was 17. Her brother had inherited it, then sold it before heading west to the goldfields. He'd sent her half the proceeds, enough to pay for a year at a teaching college, to start her new life as a governess. Or that's what he'd told her. "The sale date," Thomas said quietly. "Look at the sale date." Clara's eyes found the date. April 1883. 6 months before her brother had supposedly sold the property. And the buyer, Western Valley Holdings. "They stole your family's land," Thomas said, "just like they stole mine. And when you became a governess for the Garrett family, I became a liability," Clara finished, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. "I must have seen something or heard something, or maybe they just wanted insurance in case the Wynns ever came back asking questions. So they manufactured a theft charge, got me convicted and sent away. Made sure I'd never be credible if I tried to tell anyone what really happened." Thomas was shaking his head slowly, disbelief and rage warring on his face. "This is bigger than I thought. This isn't just about my ranch. They've been doing this systematically for years, stealing land, destroying lives, corrupting the legal system to cover their tracks." Clara thought of all the nights she'd lain awake in prison, trying to understand why the Garretts had turned on her so viciously. She'd been a good governess. The children had loved her. Mrs. Garrett had been cold but fair, and then suddenly she was a thief, a criminal, someone to be locked away and forgotten. It had never been about the money. It had been about silencing her, about making sure she could never be a credible witness to whatever the Garretts were involved in. "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas stood, the portfolio clutched in his hands, his jaw set with determination. "We expose them. We take this evidence to authorities outside Red Hollow, people who aren't on Garrett and Webb's payroll. We tell the truth about what they've done." "They killed Elizabeth to keep her quiet," Clara said. "They sent me to prison. These are powerful men, Thomas. They won't just let us walk into a sheriff's office and destroy everything they built. So we do nothing? We let them get away with murder and theft and ruining lives?" Thomas's eyes blazed with something Clara hadn't seen before. Righteous anger, hot and fierce. "Beth died trying to stop them. I won't dishonor her memory by staying silent. I'm not saying we stay silent. I'm saying we need to be smart about this. We need a plan." Before Thomas could respond, they heard Molly's voice calling from below. "Daddy? Miss Clara? Lunch is ready. I made sandwiches all by myself." The mundane interruption was jarring, a reminder that outside this loft, life continued in its normal patterns, that a little girl waited downstairs, proud of her sandwiches, unaware that her world was about to explode. Thomas looked at Clara, and she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. Not fear for themselves, but fear for Molly. What would happen to her if they pursued this? If they made themselves targets? "We protect her first," Clara said quietly. "Whatever we do, Molly's safety comes first." Thomas nodded slowly. "Agreed. We need to think this through carefully, figure out who we can trust." They climbed down from the loft, carefully hiding the portfolio behind some old feed sacks. Neither of them spoke as they walked back to the house, both lost in thought, both trying to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Molly met them at the door, beaming with pride at the slightly lopsided sandwiches she'd assembled. Clara forced a smile, praised the girl's efforts, and sat down to eat food she couldn't taste. Across the table, Thomas did the same, and Molly chattered on about the chickens and the weather and a bird's nest she'd found, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. After lunch, Thomas excused himself to check on the cattle. Clara watched him go, then turned to find Molly studying her with those too perceptive brown eyes. "Are you and Daddy fighting?" the girl asked bluntly. "No, sweetheart, we're not fighting." "You look like you're fighting. You have that pinched face that grown-ups get when they're upset but trying not to show it." Clara managed a more genuine smile. "You're too observant for your own good, you know that?" "Mama used to say the same thing. She said I noticed things other people missed." Molly tilted her head. "Is something wrong?" Clara debated how to answer. Molly deserved honesty, but she also deserved to keep her innocence a little longer. "Your daddy and I found some old papers of your mama's. They brought back some sad memories for him, that's all." "Mama's papers?" Molly's expression grew serious. "What kind of papers?" "Just notes she made about the ranch. Nothing for you to worry about." But Molly was worrying. Clara could see it in the way the girl's shoulders tensed, in the sudden stillness that came over her. "Mama was scared before she died. I was little, but I remember. She kept checking the windows at night, and she wouldn't let me play outside alone anymore. Daddy thought I didn't notice, but I did." Clara's heart clenched. "You never told anyone that?" "Who would I tell? Daddy was so sad after Mama died. I didn't want to make him sadder." Molly looked up at Clara with eyes far older than her years. "Did Mama's papers say why she was scared?" Clara chose her words carefully. "Your Mama was very brave. She found out about some bad things some people were doing, and she wanted to make them stop. That's the kind of person she was, someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. And the bad people hurt her for it." It wasn't a question. Molly said it with flat certainty, as if confirming something she'd always suspected but never dared speak aloud. "We don't know that for sure," Clara said, though the words felt like lies. "But your daddy and I are going to find out the truth. I promise you that." Molly was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then she reached out and took Clara's hand, squeezing it tight. "Don't let them hurt you too, or Daddy. I can't lose anyone else." The simple plea broke something in Clara's chest. She pulled Molly into a hug, holding her close, feeling the fragile weight of this child, who'd already lost too much. "We'll be careful," she whispered into Molly's hair. "We'll be so careful." But even as she said it, Clara knew careful might not be enough. They'd stumbled onto something bigger than a simple land dispute. They'd uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local power, that had already claimed at least one life and ruined countless others. And now they had a choice: stay silent and safe, or speak truth and risk everything. That evening, after Molly had gone to bed, Clara and Thomas sat on the porch again, the portfolio between them. They'd spent the afternoon reviewing every document, trying to understand the full scope of what Elizabeth had uncovered. "There are at least 12 families affected," Thomas said quietly. 12 properties stolen through forged documents, manufactured debts, or fraudulent legal claims. And those are just the ones Beth found. There could be more. "We need allies," Clara said. "People who've been hurt by this, who might be willing to stand with us. Power in numbers." "Most of them don't know they've been robbed. The documents are complex enough that by the time they realize what happened, it's too late. They've already lost everything." Thomas's jaw clenched. That was the genius of it. Make it look legal. Make it seem like their own fault for not reading the fine print or understanding what they were signing. "There has to be someone we can trust, a lawyer who isn't compromised, a lawman from outside the area, someone. The nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride from here, and we'd need to get to him without Garrett or Webb finding out. The moment they suspect we know something, we become targets. Thomas looked at Clara, his expression grave. Maybe you should leave. Take Molly and head east, somewhere these people can't reach you. I'll handle this alone. No. Clara's voice was firm. I'm not running anymore. I've spent 2 years running from something I didn't do, letting powerful men define who I am and what my life is worth. This is my fight as much as yours. They stole my family's land. They sent me to prison. They took years of my life. She met his eyes. I'm staying. We do this together. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, respect perhaps, or recognition of a kindred stubborn streak. Together then, but we need to be smart about this. We document everything. We make multiple copies of all this evidence and hide them in different places. We identify who we can trust, really trust, and we approach them carefully. We build our case until it's ironclad, until even corrupt officials can't ignore it. Clara paused. And we prepare for the possibility that we might lose, that we might have to run. I'm not leaving my land. Even if staying means dying for it, even if it means putting Molly in danger. The question hung heavy between them. Thomas closed his eyes, pain etched across his features. When he opened them again, the fire had dimmed slightly, replaced by grim pragmatism. We'll prepare for all possibilities, but I won't abandon what Beth died protecting. I owe her that much. Clara nodded slowly. She understood. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about honoring a woman who'd sacrificed everything to expose the truth. It was about justice for Elizabeth Reed and for all the other victims of Western Valley Holdings' greed. Then we start tomorrow, she said. We make copies, we hide them, and we start figuring out who we can trust. Tomorrow, Thomas agreed. They sat in silence after that, both aware that they'd crossed a line tonight, that by choosing to pursue this, they'd made themselves enemies of powerful men who'd already proven they were willing to kill to protect their interests. But they'd also found something unexpected in each other. Allies, partners in a fight neither could win alone. Clara had spent 2 years believing she had to face the world's cruelty by herself. Thomas had spent 3 years buried in grief, unable to see beyond his own loss. Together, they were something more, something stronger. Clara looked out at the valley, at the land that Elizabeth had loved and Thomas had fought to keep, and that powerful men wanted to steal. Somewhere out there, in the town of Red Hollow, Martin Garrett and Harrison Webb were sleeping peacefully, confident in their power, certain they'd gotten away with everything. They had no idea that a convicted thief and a grieving widower had just declared war on them, that Elizabeth Reed's carefully hidden documentation was about to become the weapon that could destroy everything they'd built. The fight ahead would be brutal. Clara had no illusions about that, but for the first time in years she felt something other than despair. She felt ready. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Clara rose before dawn as usual, started the coffee, began breakfast preparations. Her hands went through familiar motions while her mind raced with plans and contingencies. Thomas came down earlier than normal, shadows under his eyes, suggesting he'd slept as poorly as she had. I'm going into town, he said without preamble. Henderson at the general store. He's an honest man. Doesn't involve himself in town politics. I'm going to feel him out, see what he knows about Western Valley Holdings. Clara's stomach tightened with anxiety. Is that wise? Going into town so soon after finding all this? We need information. We need to understand who's involved and who might be willing to help. Thomas poured himself coffee, his movements controlled but tense. Besides, if I suddenly stop my normal routines, that's more suspicious than continuing as usual. He was right, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. Be careful what you say. If Henderson's connected to any of this, he's not. I've known him 15 years. He's a good man. Thomas met her eyes. But I'll be careful, I promise. After he left, Clara threw herself into work with manic energy. She cleaned rooms that were already clean, reorganized cupboards that didn't need organizing, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spinning out worst-case scenarios. Molly watched her with quiet concern, but didn't ask questions, seeming to sense that the adults were dealing with something beyond her understanding. It was mid-afternoon when Clara decided to tackle the root cellar, a cool, dark space beneath the kitchen that stored preserved foods and root vegetables. She'd been down there several times, but never thoroughly organized it. Today seemed as good a time as any to impose order on at least one small corner of the chaos. She was rearranging jars of preserves when she noticed something odd about the back wall. The stones didn't quite line up properly in one section, and when she pressed against them experimentally, she felt movement. Her heart rate picked up as she worked her fingers into the gaps, pulling carefully until several stones came loose, revealing a hollow space behind them. Inside was another oilcloth package. Clara's hands shook as she unwrapped it. More documents, these ones even more damning than what they'd found in the loft. Bank statements showing deposits to James Carlisle from Western Valley Holdings. Correspondence between Martin Garrett and various county officials, discussing how to handle property owners who refused to sell. And most damning of all, a letter in Harrison Webb's handwriting detailing a meeting with the woman who'd been asking too many questions and needed to be dealt with permanently. The date on that letter was December 10th, 1884. Elizabeth Reed had died on December 12th. Clara sat back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands. This was it. This was the proof that Elizabeth's death hadn't been an accident. They'd planned it. They'd murdered her because she'd gotten too close to the truth. She was still sitting there, frozen with horror and rage, when she heard horses approaching the house. Multiple horses, moving fast. Clara scrambled up the cellar stairs, reaching the kitchen just as someone pounded on the front door. "Open up! Sheriff's business!" Clara's blood turned to ice. She shoved the documents into her apron pocket and forced herself to walk calmly to the door. Through the window, she could see 3 men on horseback, one wearing a sheriff's badge, the other 2 looking like hired muscle rather than deputies. She opened the door, keeping her expression neutral. "Can I help you?" The sheriff was a heavy-set man with cold eyes and a mouth that turned down at the corners. "You Clara Wynne?" "I am." "Sheriff Porter, I need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts on the night of August 15th. Clara's mind raced. August 15th was 3 days ago. She'd been here at the ranch, had never left the property. "I was here. All evening." "Why?" "There was a fire in town that night. Henderson's general store burned to the ground. Several witnesses reported seeing a woman matching your description in the area shortly before the fire started." Porter's eyes were flat, already convinced of her guilt. "Given your history of criminal activity, I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation." The words hit like a physical blow. This was it. The setup Elizabeth had warned about in her journal. They were manufacturing another crime, another conviction, another way to silence someone who knew too much. "That's impossible," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I was here all evening. Mr. Reed can confirm it." "Mr. Reed's not here right now, is he? And even if he was, we both know how reliable the word of an employer can be when defending someone he's—" Porter let the implication hang ugly in the air. "You'll need to come with me." "She's not going anywhere." The voice came from behind Clara. She turned to see Molly standing in the kitchen doorway, her small face set with determination that echoed her mother's. "Miss Molly, this is official business," Porter said, his tone softening slightly. "Your father will understand we're just doing our jobs." "My daddy will understand that you're lying." Molly stepped forward, fearless despite being a child facing down armed men. "Miss Clara was here all night on the 15th. I know because that's the night I had a nightmare, and she sat with me until I fell back asleep. She was in my room for hours." Porter's expression hardened. "Children make mistakes about dates. It's easy to get confused." "I'm not confused, and I'm not a liar like you." Molly's voice rose, righteous anger making her shake. "You and your friends have been stealing from people. My mama found out about it, and you killed her for it." The words fell like stones into shocked silence. Porter's face went white, then red with rage. "That's a serious accusation, little girl. You better watch your mouth." "Or what? You'll kill me too?" Molly's voice broke, but she didn't back down. "I know what you did. Miss Clara knows, and my daddy knows. We found all the papers my mama hid, all the proof of what you and Mr. Garrett and Mr. Webb have been doing." Clara's heart stopped. She reached for Molly, trying to pull her back, but the damage was done. Porter's expression shifted from anger to calculation, and Clara saw the exact moment he decided they'd all become problems that needed solving. "Well," he said softly, "that changes things, doesn't it?" He turned to his men. "Search the house. Find those papers." "You have no right," Clara started, but one of the men was already pushing past her, heading for the stairs. "I have every right. You're under arrest, and this property is connected to an ongoing investigation." Porter's hand moved to his gun. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Clara's mind raced through options, all of them bad. She couldn't fight 3 armed men. She couldn't protect Molly and the evidence simultaneously. And Thomas wouldn't be back for hours, assuming he made it back at all. For all she knew, they'd already gotten to him in town. The man searching upstairs was tearing through rooms, the sound of breaking furniture and scattering belongings audible from below. Clara thought of the portfolio hidden in the barn loft, the documents in her apron pocket. They had copies, redundancies, but if Porter found everything— "There's nothing here," the searcher called down. "Just normal household stuff." Porter's eyes narrowed. "Check the barn, the outbuildings. Tear this whole place apart if you have to." He looked at Clara. "Where are they?" "I don't know what you're talking about." His backhanded slap came so fast Clara didn't have time to dodge. She stumbled, tasting blood, her vision swimming. Molly screamed and launched herself at Porter, small fists flailing. He caught her easily, holding her at arm's length while she kicked and fought. "Stop," Clara gasped. "Don't hurt her. I'll tell you where they are." "Clara, no," Molly cried. "It's all right, sweetheart." Clara straightened, wiping blood from her lip. "It's going to be all right." But it wasn't all right. Nothing about this was all right. Clara's mind worked frantically, trying to find a way out, a way to protect Molly, a way to salvage anything from this disaster. And then she heard it. The sound of more horses approaching, moving fast. Porter heard it too. His expression shifted to satisfaction. "That'll be the rest of my men. No point trying anything heroic." But when the riders came into view, Clara felt a surge of desperate hope. It was Thomas, and he wasn't alone. Behind him rode Henderson from the general store, very much alive and unburned, along with 3 other men Clara recognized from brief trips to town. And at the rear, wearing a federal marshal's badge, was a hard-faced older man with steel-gray hair. Thomas took in the scene in an instant, Clara's bleeding lip, Molly struggling in Porter's grip, the men searching his property. His face went cold with fury. "Let my daughter go, now!" Porter released Molly, who ran to her father, but his hand stayed near his gun. "Reed, I'm placing your employee under arrest for arson. You'd be wise not to interfere with the law." "That's interesting," the federal marshal said, his voice carrying the weight of real authority. "Seeing as how Henderson's store is still standing, hard to arrest someone for burning down a building that's not burned." Porter's face went carefully blank. "I received reports." "You received orders to manufacture a charge and silence a witness." The marshal dismounted, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm Marshal William Thorne, and I've been investigating Western Valley Holdings for the past 6 months. Mr. Reed came to me in town today with some very interesting documents that corroborate everything my investigation has uncovered." Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. Thomas had found help. Real help. Porter's hand moved toward his gun, but Thorne was faster, his own weapon drawn and aimed before Porter could clear leather. "I wouldn't. Your men are outnumbered, and I've got federal warrants for the arrest of Martin Garrett, Harrison Webb, and James Carlisle. Your name's on the list too, Porter. Conspiracy, fraud, and murder." "Murder?" Porter tried for outrage, but his voice shook. "That's ridiculous. Elizabeth Reed's death is being reinvestigated as a homicide. We have correspondence proving premeditation." Thorne's eyes were chips of ice. "And we have witness testimony from 4 other landowners who've come forward in the past month, all telling the same story of corruption and systematic theft. Your conspiracy's been falling apart for weeks, Porter. You just didn't know it." The sheriff's face crumbled as he realized it was over. His men, seeing the situation clearly, carefully removed their gun belts and raised their hands. Within minutes, Thorne had them all in custody, and Clara was standing on her own porch watching the men who'd tried to destroy her life being led away in chains. Thomas dismounted and came to her, Molly still in his arms. Are you hurt? Nothing serious. Clara touched her split lip gingerly. How did you... I thought you were just going to talk to Henderson. I was. But when I got to town, I found out that Garrett had left for the territorial capital 3 days ago in a hurry. Webb tried to withdraw all his funds from the bank yesterday, and the tellers refused. They'd already been contacted by federal investigators. The whole thing was collapsing. Thomas shifted Molly in his arms. Henderson told me Marshal Thorne had been working undercover for months, gathering evidence. I went straight to him with what we found. He'd been waiting for something concrete enough to move on. Elizabeth's journal and documentation gave him everything he needed. Marshal Thorne approached, having finished securing his prisoners. Mrs. Wynne, I apologize for what you've endured. Your conviction is being overturned as we speak. You were a victim of a conspiracy to obstruct justice, and you'll receive compensation from the territorial government for your wrongful imprisonment. Clara could barely process the words. Overturned, wrongful imprisonment, compensation. Things she'd stopped believing were possible. My family's land, she whispered. They stole it. Can I... Property restoration is part of the restitution process. It'll take time, but yes, you'll get your land back. Thorne's expression softened slightly. You should know, Miss Wynne, that your case was what first alerted us to this conspiracy. When we started investigating Western Valley Holdings, we noticed a pattern of arrests coinciding with property acquisitions. Your case was particularly egregious, a clear frame-up with forged authorizations. It became the thread that unraveled everything. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, too overwhelmed to stop them. 2 years. 2 years of running and hiding and believing herself permanently marked as a criminal. And it had all been a lie. A calculated cruelty designed to silence her before she even knew there was anything to speak about. Beth's journal, Thomas said quietly to the marshal. Will it be enough to prove what happened to her? Combined with the correspondence we found and testimony from several of Garrett's associates who are willing to turn evidence for lighter sentences, yes, we can prove she was murdered. We can prove who ordered it. Thorne paused. I can't bring her back, Mr. Reed, but I can make sure the men responsible face justice. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. That's all I can ask for. The marshal left to transport his prisoners to the territorial capital, taking several of the townsmen with him as witnesses and additional security. Henderson stayed behind, looking apologetic and uncomfortable. Tom, I'm sorry, he said. I knew something was wrong in Red Hollow, but I never imagined the scope of it. If I'd spoken up sooner, maybe Beth... It's not your fault, Thomas interrupted. They were powerful men. They knew how to keep people quiet. He shifted Molly to his other hip. Thank you for coming with me today. For believing us. That's what neighbors do. Henderson glanced at Clara. Miss Wynne, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the whole town. The way you were treated at Maggie's place, the assumptions people made, it was shameful. When word gets out about what really happened, I think you'll find folks eager to make amends. Clara managed a wan smile. I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson. After Henderson left, the three of them stood in the yard, exhausted and stunned by how quickly everything had changed. Molly had finally stopped crying but clung to her father like a burr, her face buried in his shirt. Is it really over? Clara asked. Just like that? The immediate danger, yes. The legal process will take months, maybe years. Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable. Your name's been cleared. You're free to go wherever you want now. No more running. The words should have felt like liberation. Instead, they felt like a door closing. Clara realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want to go anywhere, that this ranch, this family, had become more than a temporary refuge. Somewhere between organizing root cellars and reading bedtime stories and standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas against corrupt men with guns, she'd stopped being a passing stranger. Where would I go? She asked softly. Thomas's expression shifted, hope flickering in his eyes before he could hide it. You could rebuild on your family's land. Start fresh somewhere you have roots. I could. Clara looked at the house, the barn, the valley stretching out before them. Or I could stay here, if that's something you'd want. Daddy wants it, Molly spoke up, her voice muffled but certain. He likes you. He smiles more when you're around, and I want you to stay forever. Molly, Thomas said, embarrassed. That's not, you can't just. It's true, though. Molly lifted her head, looking between them with exasperation. Grown-ups are so silly sometimes. You both want the same thing, but you're too scared to say it. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. She looked at Thomas, saw the same flush on his face, and suddenly laughed. The sound startled her, full and genuine, the first real laugh she'd had in years. She's not wrong, Clara admitted. I do want to stay, if you'll have me. Not just as hired help, but as… She struggled for the right word. As family, maybe, in whatever form that takes. Thomas set Molly down carefully, then took a step toward Clara. I'd like that. Beth would have liked it too. She believed in second chances, in people finding their way home. His voice roughened with emotion. You've been home for a while now, Clara. I just didn't know how to say it. Clara closed the distance between them, and when Thomas's arms came around her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something that should have happened long ago. Molly wrapped herself around both their legs, creating a messy, imperfect circle of three people who'd found each other against all odds. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the fading afternoon light, while the valley stretched out peaceful and beautiful around them. Somewhere in town, the machinery of justice was grinding forward. Somewhere, corrupt men were facing consequences for their actions. Somewhere, the truth was finally being told. But here, in this moment, there was just relief and gratitude and the tentative hope that maybe, finally, the worst was behind them. Clara had been so wrong, she realized. The storms in life didn't always just destroy. Sometimes they washed away the lies and corruption that had been suffocating everything good. Sometimes they cleared the air enough to let new growth take root. Sometimes they brought broken people together and gave them a chance to heal. The weeks that followed were strange and overwhelming in their own way. News of the conspiracy's exposure spread through the territory like wildfire. More victims came forward, families who'd lost land, people who'd been run out of town, others like Clara who'd been falsely imprisoned or accused. The scope of Western Valley Holdings' corruption was staggering, involving dozens of officials across multiple counties. Garrett and Webb were arrested trying to flee to Mexico. Carlisle turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed testimony about how the conspiracy had operated. Sheriff Porter and 6 other officials were charged with various crimes ranging from fraud to murder. Elizabeth Reed's death was officially ruled a homicide. Thomas testified at the preliminary hearings, his voice steady but his hands shaking as he described his wife's fears in the months before she died. The letter discussing how to deal with her was entered into evidence. 3 men were ultimately charged with her murder. 2 hired thugs and Harrison Webb himself, who'd apparently decided that eliminating the problem directly was more efficient than trying to buy her silence. Clara attended the hearings when she could, watching the men who destroyed her life face justice. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it mostly felt exhausting and sad, a reckoning that came too late to undo the damage they'd caused. Her exoneration was formalized in early October. A judge officially overturned her conviction, expunged her record, and issued a public apology for the miscarriage of justice. The Garrett family's assets were seized pending litigation, and Clara was awarded substantial compensation, enough to rebuild her life several times over. The town of Red Hollow reacted with mixed shame and eagerness to make amends. Maggie came to the ranch personally to apologize for throwing Clara out of her diner, tears streaming down her face as she begged forgiveness. Others followed. Townspeople who'd judged her, who'd believed the lies, who'd made her feel less than human. Clara accepted their apologies with grace she didn't entirely feel, understanding that mob mentality and powerful lies could corrupt even decent people. Through it all, the ranch remained her anchor. Thomas taught her to ride properly, to read the signs of weather changing, to understand the rhythms of the land. Molly dragged her on adventures through the valley, showing her every secret spot Elizabeth had once shown her. And slowly, carefully, Clara and Thomas built something new between them, not rushing, not trying to replace what he'd lost, but creating space for what they'd both found. One evening in late October, as winter's first hint touched the air, Clara stood in the parlor looking at Elizabeth's rocking chair. It was still there, still untouched, still holding its sacred space. "You could move it if you want," Thomas said from behind her. "Or we could move it together, make this room usable again." Clara turned to look at him. What do you want to do? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. I think Beth would want this room to be lived in, would want that chair to rock children again, to be part of life rather than a monument to death. He moved to stand beside Clara. But I don't know if I can do it alone. You're not alone, Clara said simply. Together they moved the rocking chair to Molly's room, where it would be used and loved rather than preserved in grief. They cleared out the parlor, cleaning and rearranging, slowly transforming it from a shrine into a living space. It hurt. Clara could see that in Thomas's face, in the way his hands lingered on certain objects. But it was a healing kind of hurt, the pain of a wound finally being properly cleaned so it could close. That night, after Molly was asleep, Thomas and Clara sat on the porch as they so often did. But this time, Thomas reached over and took her hand, holding it gently but firmly. I don't know what we're building here, he said quietly. It's too soon to call it anything definite. But I know I want you here, not as an employee, not even just as family, as something more. Clara's heart stuttered. Thomas, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just need you to know that's where my heart is headed. Has been for a while, if I'm honest. He squeezed her hand. Take whatever time you need. I'll wait. Clara looked at their joined hands, at this good man who'd offered her shelter when she had nothing, who'd believed in her innocence when everyone else saw only a criminal, who'd fought beside her against impossible odds. She thought about Elizabeth's journal, about the love that had poured from every page, about how Thomas honored that love not by staying frozen in grief, but by remaining the kind of man who could offer kindness to strangers and justice to the wronged. I don't need time, she said softly. My heart's been headed there too. I just didn't think I had the right to want it. Thomas turned to look at her, and the hope in his eyes took her breath away. You have every right. You've earned every good thing this world can give you, Clara Wynne. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But Clara didn't pull away. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home and setting out on a new journey simultaneously. It was gentle and careful and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling, real smiles, the kind that came from deep places that had been dark too long. Molly's going to be insufferable, Thomas said, laughing quietly. She's been planning our wedding since about a week after you arrived. Smart girl. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of him, the solid reality of a future she'd stopped believing was possible. Takes after her mother. They sat together as the stars came out, making quiet plans and sharing comfortable silences, while inside the house a child slept peacefully, dreaming of the family that had rebuilt itself from loss and lies and unlikely love. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Legal battles still loomed, community relationships needed mending, and they were still learning how to navigate their feelings for each other. But they would face it together, three people who'd been broken and scattered, finding wholeness in each other. Clara had come to this valley with nothing but a past she couldn't escape. She was staying with a future she'd helped create, built on truth and justice and the stubborn belief that people deserve second chances. Some people pass through places, leaving barely a trace. Others become the foundation upon which new stories are built, the steady ground where healing can finally take root. Clara Wynne had stopped passing through. She was home. Winter came to the valley with unexpected gentleness that year, the snow falling soft and steady rather than in the violent storms that usually marked the season. Clara stood at the kitchen window on a December morning, watching the white world transform everything familiar into something new and clean, and thought about how much had changed in the 4 months since Marshall Thorne had ridden away with his prisoners. The trials had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Martin Garrett and Harrison Webb were sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison for fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. The two men who'd actually killed Elizabeth Reed were sentenced to hang, their executions scheduled for spring. James Carlisle received 10 years for his role in the conspiracy, his legal career destroyed beyond any hope of redemption. Sheriff Porter got 15 years, and 6 other officials received varying sentences based on their involvement. Clara had attended the final day of sentencing, sitting in the crowded courtroom beside Thomas and Molly. When the judge read the verdicts, she'd expected to feel triumph or satisfaction. Instead, she'd felt only a deep, weary relief. Justice had been served, but it couldn't erase the years she'd lost or bring Elizabeth back or undo the damage done to dozens of families across the territory. What it could do was draw a line. This chapter was closed. What came next was up to them. The compensation she'd received had been substantial, $10,000 for wrongful imprisonment, plus the restoration of her family's land in Silver Springs. The property was worth another $8,000 at current market rates. Clara had never imagined possessing such wealth. For weeks after the bank draft arrived, she'd simply stared at it, unable to fully comprehend what it meant. Thomas had been characteristically practical. "It's your money, Clara. You use it however you see fit. No one can tell you what to do with it." But that was the problem. Clara had no idea what she wanted to do. She'd spent so long just surviving that the prospect of actually building a life felt overwhelming. The only thing she knew with certainty was that she wanted to build it here, with Thomas and Molly, in this valley that had become home. The answer came to her one evening in late November, when Molly had been struggling over a book that was slightly too advanced for her reading level. The girl's frustration had been palpable, and Clara had sat with her for over an hour, patiently working through the difficult passages. "I wish there was a school closer," Molly had said wistfully. "Miss Peters in town is nice, but it's so far to ride every day, and she has too many students to help everyone who needs it." Thomas had looked up from the harness he was mending. "There used to be a school in the valley, years back, but the teacher left and no one ever replaced her. Most folks teach their children at home if they can read themselves. If they can't," he'd shrugged helplessly. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Molly's words, about all the children in the valley and surrounding areas who had limited access to education, about how knowledge had been her salvation, reading and writing had given her options, had made her valuable as a governess, had allowed her to document her own story when the legal system failed her. By morning, she knew what she wanted to do. "I want to open a school," she told Thomas over breakfast. "A real school, free for any child who wants to attend. I could convert part of the barn loft, or we could build a separate structure. I have the money now. I could pay a fair wage to anyone who wants to help teach, buy proper books and supplies." Thomas had stared at her for a long moment, then slowly smiled. One of those rare, full smiles that transformed his entire face. Beth would have loved that idea. She always said education was the way to break cycles of poverty and powerlessness. "Then you think it's a good idea?" "I think it's perfect." He'd reached across the table to take her hand. "And I think we should do it together. You teach, I'll help build and maintain the space. Make it a real community resource." Molly had been so excited she'd literally bounced in her chair. "Can I help? Please. I could assist with the younger children. I could show them how to write their letters." So they'd begun planning in earnest. Thomas and several men from town had spent weeks converting the barn loft into a proper schoolroom, installing windows for light, building desks and benches, creating a space that was warm and welcoming. Clara had traveled to the territorial capital to purchase books, slates, chalk, and all the supplies a proper school needed. She'd also placed advertisements in newspapers across the territory, looking for qualified teachers who might want to join her venture. The response had been overwhelming. By early December, she had 3 teachers lined up, 2 young women fresh from normal school and an older gentleman who'd taught for years but had retired when his wife died. Together, they could offer instruction in reading, writing, mathematics, history, and even some science and art. The school was set to open after the new year, but Clara's plans extended far beyond just teaching children. She wanted to offer evening classes for adults who'd never learned to read. She wanted a lending library where anyone could borrow books. She wanted this place to become what Elizabeth had envisioned, a source of empowerment for people who'd been kept powerless too long. But there was something else she needed to do first, something more personal. On a clear day in mid-December, Clara asked Thomas to take her to the creek where Elizabeth had died. He'd gone pale at the request, his jaw tightening with old grief. "Why would you want to go there?" "Because she deserves to be remembered in that place. Because it shouldn't only hold tragedy." Clara had taken his hand gently. "You don't have to come if it's too hard. I can go alone." "No." Thomas's voice was rough but determined. "If you're going, we go together, as a family." So the 3 of them had bundled up against the cold and walked down to the creek together, Molly between them holding both their hands. The water ran dark and swift, ice forming along the edges, but the current still strong enough to resist freezing completely. Thomas stood at the bank, staring at the spot where his wife had died, and Clara saw 3 years of grief and guilt and unanswered questions written across his face. She squeezed his hand, offering silent support. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he whispered. "I should have been with her, should have protected her." "She knew you would have," Clara said softly. "That's why she tried to handle it alone, to protect you and Molly from danger. She died fighting for what was right, Thomas. That's not a failure, that's heroism." Molly pulled away from them and walked to the water's edge, her small face serious. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something Clara couldn't see, then tossed it into the creek. It flashed briefly in the winter sunlight. A penny, Clara realized. A penny for remembrance. "Bye, Mama," Molly said quietly. "I still miss you every day. But Miss Clara takes good care of us now. I think you'd like her. I think you'd be happy that we're happy again." She paused, then added with the brutal honesty of childhood, "It's okay if Daddy loves her too. You can both be special. Hearts are big enough for that." Thomas made a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a laugh. He knelt beside his daughter and pulled her into a fierce hug, his shoulders shaking. Clara watched them, tears streaming down her own face, understanding that this was a watershed moment, the past being honored while the future was finally given permission to arrive. When Thomas stood again, his eyes were red but clearer than Clara had ever seen them. "Thank you," he said simply, "for knowing we needed this." They walked back to the house hand in hand, the three of them, and Clara felt the last shadow of Elizabeth's death lift. It would always be part of their story, but it no longer had to define them. They could move forward now, carrying her memory with love rather than drowning in grief. That evening, Thomas surprised Clara by asking her to walk with him out to the eastern pasture. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. They stood together watching the light fade, their breath-making clouds in the cold air. "I've been thinking," Thomas said carefully, "about what comes next. For us." Clara's heart rate picked up. They'd been carefully dancing around the future for weeks now, both aware that their feelings had deepened into something serious, but neither quite ready to name it. "What have you been thinking?" "That Molly was right back in October. We both want the same thing, but we're too scared to say it." He turned to face her fully. "I love you, Clara. I didn't think I could love anyone again after Beth died, but you've shown me that the heart doesn't replace, it expands. There's room for both, room for honoring what was and embracing what is." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I just didn't think I deserved—" "Stop." Thomas cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You deserve everything good this world has to offer. You deserve love and security and a place to belong. And I want to give you all of that, if you'll let me." "Yes," Clara whispered. "Yes to all of it." Thomas smiled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. This was Beth's ring. She'd want you to have it, want you to wear it. But if you'd rather have something new, something that's just ours. Clara took the box with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a simple gold band with a small sapphire, elegant in its unpretentiousness. It was perfect. "I'd be honored to wear Elizabeth's ring," she said softly. "She brought us together in a way, through her journal and her courage. This feels right." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her, sweet and deep and full of promise, while the valley spread out around them in winter's peaceful embrace. When they returned to the house, Molly took one look at Clara's hand and let out a shriek of pure joy that probably scared every animal within a mile radius. She launched herself at both of them, talking so fast her words tumbled over each other. "I knew it! I knew you'd get married. Can I be in the wedding? Can we have a cake? Can we do it soon? Can my dress be blue? Can—" "Breathe, sweetheart," Thomas laughed, catching her mid-bounce. "We haven't even planned anything yet." "But you will, right? You'll get married soon?" Clara and Thomas looked at each other, and Clara saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They'd both waited long enough for happiness. Why wait any longer? "How about spring?" Clara suggested. "After the school opens and settles into routine. Maybe in April, when the valley's starting to green up again. April, Thomas agreed. That gives us time to do it right. Molly's squeal this time was even louder. The winter months passed in a blur of preparation and planning. The school opened in early January to an initial enrollment of 23 children ranging from age 5 to 15. More students trickled in over the following weeks as word spread that the education was free and of high quality. By March, they had 40 students and a waiting list. Clara threw herself into teaching with a passion she hadn't known she possessed. These children, many from families that had been victims of Western Valley Holdings corruption, deserved every opportunity to build better futures. She worked tirelessly to reach each one, to understand their individual needs and learning styles, to make education accessible and exciting. The evening adult classes were equally successful, with parents and grandparents coming to learn the skills they'd been denied in their own youth. Clara would never forget the sight of a 60-year-old rancher painstakingly writing his name for the first time, tears streaming down his weathered face as he realized he'd finally gained the ability to sign legal documents himself, to never again be at the mercy of others who could read what he couldn't. Through it all, Thomas was her steadfast support. He expanded the barn to accommodate more students, built additional classroom space, and even taught occasional lessons on practical mathematics, how to calculate feed costs, measure acreage, understand market prices. He and Clara made a good team, their skills complementing each other perfectly. The wedding was planned for April 20th, to be held at the ranch under the old pine tree that overlooked the valley. It would be simple, just family and close friends, a celebration of new beginnings rather than a grand social event. Clara had no desire for elaborate ceremony. What mattered was the commitment they were making to each other and to Molly, the family they were choosing to become. Maggie from the diner insisted on making the cake, her way of continuing to make amends for that first day. Henderson and his wife offered to host a community dinner afterward, turning the celebration into a valley-wide event. Even Marshall Thorne sent word that he'd try to attend if his duties allowed. Clara spent her evening sewing her wedding dress. Nothing fancy, just a simple cream-colored gown that would be practical enough to wear again on special occasions. Molly was making flower crowns from dried blooms, determined that everyone would wear one even if it wasn't traditional. Thomas built new furniture for the house, preparing spaces for their combined life. But as the wedding approached, Clara found herself growing increasingly anxious. Not about marrying Thomas. She'd never been more certain of anything, but about whether she truly deserved this happiness, this second chance at a life she'd thought was lost forever. It was Molly who finally cut through her spiral of doubt. The girl found Clara sitting on the porch one evening in early April, staring out at the valley with tears streaming down her face. "Miss Clara, what's wrong?" Clara tried to smile, to brush it off, but Molly was too perceptive. The girl climbed into her lap, getting almost too big for it now, but Clara held her close anyway. "I'm scared," Clara admitted, "that I'm not good enough for this, that I don't deserve your father, or you, or this beautiful life we're building." Molly pulled back to look at her with those ancient, knowing eyes. "That's silly. You're exactly good enough. You're the best." "But I was in prison, Molly. I have a past that—" "You have a past where bad people lied about you and you survived it anyway," Molly interrupted with fierce certainty. "That doesn't make you not good enough. That makes you strong. That makes you exactly the kind of person who deserves good things." Clara felt something break open in her chest, years of shame and self-doubt finally cracking under the weight of a child's unconditional love. "When did you get so wise?" she whispered. "Mama used to say that children see true because we haven't learned to lie to ourselves yet." Molly snuggled back against Clara's chest. "You belong here, Miss Clara. You've always belonged here. You just had to find your way home." Clara held her tight, this child who would soon officially be her daughter, and let herself finally believe it. She did belong here, not despite her past, but because of everything she'd survived and overcome. She'd earned this happiness through sheer, stubborn persistence, through refusing to let cruel people define her worth, through choosing to stay when running would have been easier. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, spring asserting itself with enthusiasm. The valley had transformed into a riot of wildflowers and new grass, the air sweet with the scent of blooming things. Clara woke early, nerves and excitement making sleep impossible, and found Thomas already up and working. "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony," she teased, coming to stand beside him in the barn. "Traditional nonsense," Thomas said, but he smiled. "Besides, I've seen you every day for 9 months. Not seeing you for a few hours isn't going to make the ceremony more special. You already make every day special just by being in it." Clara's heart melted. "That's possibly the sweetest thing you've ever said to me." "Don't get used to it. I'm not good with words." But his eyes were soft with affection. "Are you ready for this? Really ready? Because once we say those vows, I'm not letting you go. You're stuck with me and Molly and this ranch, and probably a dozen more problems we haven't even encountered yet." "I'm counting on it," Clara said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "I've been running my whole life, Thomas. I'm done running. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The ceremony that afternoon was everything Clara could have hoped for. The whole valley seemed to have turned out. Families they'd helped through the school, people whose land had been restored, townsfolk who'd learned the truth and wanted to show their support. Even some of the other teachers from the school had traveled out to attend. Marshall Thorne arrived just as they were starting, looking tired but pleased. "Wouldn't miss this," he told them. "Besides, I wanted to bring you something." He handed Clara an envelope. "This arrived at my office last week. Thought you'd want to see it." Clara opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter from her brother, the first she'd heard from him in over a decade. He'd read about her exoneration in a San Francisco newspaper and had been desperately trying to track her down. He was married now, with 3 children, managing a successful freight business. He wanted to reconnect, to make amends for disappearing when she'd needed family most. Clara read through tears, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. Her brother was alive. He wanted to know her again. After years of believing herself utterly alone in the world, she had family beyond Thomas and Molly. "He says he wants to visit," she told Thomas, her voice shaking. "Wants his children to know their aunt." "Then we'll welcome them," Thomas said simply. "Family's important. We'll make room." They stood under the old pine tree as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, facing each other while a traveling minister, a friend of Marshall Thorne's, led them through their vows. Clara spoke her promises clearly, meaning every word. To love and honor, to stand beside through whatever came, to build a life together based on truth and trust and stubborn hope. Thomas's vows were simpler, but no less profound. "I promise to be worthy of your faith in me, to protect what we're building here, to love you for exactly who you are, not who anyone thinks you should be, and to make sure you never doubt that you belong, that you're home." When they kissed, sealing their promises, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Molly rushed forward, throwing her arms around both of them, and Clara felt the last piece of her broken heart click into place. The celebration afterward was joyous and chaotic, with more food than they could possibly eat, and music from a local fiddler who played until his fingers cramped. Clara danced with Thomas, with Molly, with Henderson and Marshall Thorne, and half a dozen students from the school. She laughed until her sides hurt, ate until she was stuffed, and basked in the warmth of being surrounded by genuine community. As the evening wore down and guests began to depart, Clara found herself standing with Thomas at the edge of the gathering, watching Molly play with other children in the last light of day. "Did you ever imagine this?" Thomas asked quietly. "When you showed up here last summer, starving and desperate, did you think it could lead to this?" Clara thought about that woman who'd been turned away from the diner, who'd followed a strange child home because she had nothing left to lose. That woman had been so certain that happiness was for other people, that she was permanently broken by what she'd endured. "No," she admitted, "I couldn't have imagined any of this, but I'm so grateful I stayed long enough to find out what was possible." Thomas pulled her close, and they stood together watching their daughter, because Molly was Clara's daughter now, legally and completely, laugh and play in the twilight. Around them, the valley stretched out in peaceful beauty, transformed by spring but eternal in its strength. "Thank you," Thomas said softly, "for staying, for believing, for helping us become a family again." "Thank you for seeing me," Clara replied. "Not my past or my mistakes or the lies people told about me. Just me." They stood in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one. Eventually, they would go inside to their home, expanded now to accommodate their growing family. Tomorrow, Clara would return to teaching and Thomas to ranching, and they'd continue building the life they'd chosen. There would be challenges ahead, inevitable difficulties that came with any life fully lived. But tonight, Clara allowed herself to simply exist in this moment of perfect peace. She thought about the pendant Thomas had given her last month, engraved with words that captured her entire journey, not passing through anymore. She'd arrived in Red Hollow as a ghost of her former self, convinced that permanent belonging was impossible for someone with her history. She'd been so wrong. Belonging wasn't about having a perfect past or an unblemished reputation. It was about finding people who saw your truth and chose to stand with you anyway. It was about building something worth staying for, worth fighting for, worth calling home. Clara Wynne Reed, and oh, how she loved having that full name now, had finally stopped running. She'd put down roots in unlikely soil and somehow, impossibly, had grown into something beautiful. The woman who'd been broken by injustice had become a teacher who empowered others to stand against their own injustices. The woman who'd been lost had become a mother to a child who needed her. The woman who'd been alone had become a wife to a man who'd been alone too. And together they'd found that healing was possible when you had someone to share the burden. Some people pass through places, leaving barely a trace. Others become the foundation upon which entire communities are built. Clara had become the latter, not through any grand design, but through small acts of courage repeated daily. Through choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. Through choosing to trust when suspicion would have been safer. Through choosing to love when loss seemed inevitable. The school would continue to grow, eventually expanding to include a proper lending library and hosting lectures from traveling scholars. Clara's brother would visit next year with his family, beginning a reconciliation that would enrich all their lives. Molly would grow up strong and educated, eventually becoming a teacher herself, carrying forward the legacy her mothers, both of them, had begun. The valley would thrive as the stolen land was returned and honest governance replaced corruption. But all of that was future. Tonight, Clara simply stood with her husband and watched their daughter play under emerging stars, feeling the weight of belonging settle warm and permanent in her chest. She was home. Finally, impossibly, completely home. And she was never passing through again.